The winter her father died, Adelia Vaughn learned that a stopped clock is the loudest thing in a house, that a workshop in which 40 timepieces have all fallen silent at once does not fall quiet but seems, instead, to roar, and that the roaring is the sound of your own heart discovering it has nothing left to keep time by. She was 23 that January, a slight straight young woman with a clockmaker's steady hands and a clockmaker's patient eyes. Dark hair she wore coiled plain because there had never been money for a maid to dress it, and never anyone she cared to dress it for, and a face that men in the town of Harrowden called grave until they saw her bent over the open back of a bracket clock, with the loop screwed into her eye and a hairspring balanced on the tip of a needle. And then they called it something else, though they could not always have said what. Her father, Elias Vaughn, had been the finest clockmaker in the 3 northern counties, a spare, gentle, exacting man who had taught his daughter, from the time she could sit up on a high stool at his bench, everything he knew, because her mother had died bringing her into the world, and there had been no son, and Elias Vaughn had looked at the grave, watchful infant left to him, and had done the thing that scandalized the town, which was to raise a girl to his trade as though she were a boy, so that Adelia Vaughn could strip and clean and rebuild a repeating watch before she could properly plait her own hair, could hear a sick movement the way a physician hears a sick chest, could tell you, with her eyes shut, from the tick alone, whether a clock was starved of oil or worn in the palates or only, as clocks sometimes are, lonely and neglected and wanting to be wound. He had left her when the lung fever took him in 9 gray days that January, the lease of a workshop she could not afford to keep, a debt to the timber merchant and another to the brass founder that between them came to more than everything she owned, a bench of tools with his hands worn into the handles, and a single sentence spoken on the last afternoon in the thread of a voice the fever had left him, that she was to remember all her life. He had held her hand in his ruined one, and he had said, "Keep the good ones going. Della, whatever else you must let go, keep the good ones going, because a clock is a promise a man makes to the time he will not live to see, and it is a poor sort of world that lets the promises run down." And then he had died, 7 minutes past 4 on a Tuesday afternoon, and Adelia Vaughn had gone through the cold workshop that evening and wound every clock in it, all 40, the good and the plain alike, because she could not yet do the thing the creditors would shortly make her do, which was to let them stop. The creditors were not cruel men, only frightened ones, tradesmen with their own debts, and they were sorry for the clockmaker's daughter, but sorrow does not pay a brass founder, and by the end of that first bitter month it was plain to Adelia that the workshop must go, the lease surrendered, the tools sold, the good clocks and the plain clocks alike carried out into the January street and knocked down to strangers, and that she herself, 23 and trained to the one trade in England no one would let a woman practice for pay, would be fortunate to find a place as an upper servant in a house that did not look too closely at where a genteel, penniless young woman had come from. She had begun, in the evenings, to write the humiliating letters, the applications for situations as housekeeper, as companion, as sewing woman, when the other letter came, the one that turned her whole life, and it came, as the great turns in a life so often do, disguised as a small piece of business. It was brought up from the coaching inn on a raw February morning by a boy who said a gentleman's servant had left it, and it was written on thick paper with a crest pressed into the wax that Adelia did not know the reading of, and it was from a Mr. Ambrose Coyle, who described himself as steward and man of business to His Grace the Duke of Wexmore, and it asked, in the dry, careful language of a man choosing his words with unusual care, whether Miss Vaughn, daughter of the late Mr. Elias Vaughan, clockmaker, was the same Miss Vaughan who had assisted her father some years since in the great work he had done upon the clocks of Wexmore Hall, and whether, if so, she might be prevailed upon to wait upon the steward at the hall at her earliest convenience upon a matter of business touching those same clocks, her expenses to be met and her time to be paid, and the whole to be treated, the letter ended with particular discretion. Adelia sat a long while with that letter by the workshop window in the grey light, and remembered. She had been 16 when her father was called to Wexmore, and it had been the great commission of his life, for the hall held among its treasures a clock famous through the north of England, the Wexmore astronomical clock, a towering ancient movement of blackened brass and silvered dials that stood 2 stories high in a stone chamber of the west tower, and told, besides the hour, the day and the month and the phase of the moon, and the wandering of the 5 known planets against the fixed stars. A machine 300 years old that a Duke of Wexmore, in the reign of the first Elizabeth, had brought from the Low Countries at a cost that had half beggared the estate, and that had run, with the care of a succession of clockmakers, for the whole of those 300 years, until in her father's day it had at last grown so worn and so choked with the labor of centuries that it had begun to falter, and the old Duke, the present Duke's father, had sent for Elias Vaughan to make it whole. Her father had taken the commission and had taken his daughter with him, because he needed small clever hands for the small clever work, and had long since stopped pretending that his daughters were not the cleverest he knew. And Adelia had spent 1 whole golden autumn of her 16th year at Wexmore Hall, living among the upper servants, going up each morning with her father to the cold stone tower chamber, and there, in the smell of brass and oil and old stone, the 2 of them had taken the great heart of the hall to pieces over the course of 11 weeks. Every wheel and pinion and arbor of it cleaned and trued and rebuilt what 3 centuries had worn, and set it going again. And Adelia had stood beside her father in the tower chamber on the November midnight when they finished, and had heard the great clock take up its beat once more, a slow deep talk like the pulse of the house itself, and had watched the silvered moon on its dial begin again its patient climb, and had thought at 16 that she had never in her life been anywhere she so entirely belonged. And she remembered, too, though she had been only a tradesman's girl beneath the notice of the family, the once or twice she had seen them, the grave old Duke who came up to the tower to watch the work with a reverence that told her the great clock was to him not a possession but very nearly a living ancestor, and once, on the stairs, the old Duke's son and heir, the Marquess as he then was. A tall, dark, serious young man of 25, who had stood aside on the narrow tower stair to let the clockmaker's daughter pass with her tray of tools, and had inclined his head to her, gravely, as though she were a lady, so that she had gone up the rest of the stairs with her face warm and had been ashamed of herself for it, a clockmaker's girl blushing at a marquis's courtesy like a housemaid in a ballad. That had been 7 years ago. The old Duke was dead now, she knew. These 3 years, the grave young Marquis was the Duke of Wexmore now, and the great clock she and her father had set going was, the steward's careful letter seemed somehow to be telling her without telling her, in some trouble again, and they had thought of the one person left alive besides her father, now that her father was in the churchyard, who knew the inside of it. She wrote back the same day and said that she would come. She went up to Wexmore on the last day of February, and the manner of her going told her, before ever she reached the hall, that something at Wexmore was very wrong. For the hall sent its own carriage down to the town to fetch her, which was a courtesy far beyond what a steward would show a tradesman's daughter come on a paid errand, and the 2 grave menservants who handed her up into it were dressed in mourning black, though the old Duke was 3 years dead. And when she remarked upon it, gently, the elder of them looked at her with a still closed face, and said only that the hall had had a great loss, miss, and did not say what, and drew the blind of his own reticence down over the subject so plainly that she asked no more. The country changed as they climbed, the walled fields giving way to open moor going brown and gray to a bruised February sky, and then the road dropped into the long wooded dale of the Wex, the little river bright and swollen with winter rain in the bottom of it, and Adelia sat forward on the seat as the miles of the estate's gray boundary wall began to run beside the road, and remembered the last time she had come this way, 16 and beside her father with her whole life in front of her, and had to set her jaw against the ache of it. The carriage turned at last between the great stone gate piers she remembered, each topped with a carved stone falcon worn by the weather, and up the long, climbing drive through the bare beech woods, and when the trees drew back there was the hall, exactly as her memory had kept it, and yet not, a long and lovely and immensely old gray house of many gables and 100 mullioned windows, standing on its shelf of the hillside above the falling gardens, with the wooded fell rising behind and the whole of the dale spread below, and rising from the west end of it, square and battlemented and dark against the moving sky, the tower, the clock tower, in whose high stone chamber the great heart of Wexmore had beaten for 300 years. And Adelia looked up at the tower first, before she looked at anything else, because she could not help it, and saw, on its south face below the battlements, the great blue and gold circle of the outer dial, and even from the drive, even at that distance, her clockmaker's eye caught the thing that was wrong, and her heart turned over in her, for the long golden hand of the great dial was not moving, and the shorter hand stood beside it, the two of them frozen together near the top of the dial, near the figure 12, stopped, and she understood, with a cold, slow certainty that she could not yet account for, that the great Wexmore clock, the clock she and her father had set going on a November midnight 7 years before, had stopped. The steward met her himself in the great stone-flagged hall, Mr. Ambrose Coyle, a smooth, full-fleshed man of 50 in good black broadcloth, with a soft, careful voice and eyes that did a great deal of watching, and he thanked her for coming with a warmth that did not quite reach those watching eyes, and he took her not to a servant's parlor but to his own comfortable office in the estate wing, and gave her wine she did not drink, and made a great deal of the honor her father's name had done the house, and it was some while before Adelia, who had her father's patience, understood that the smooth steward was working his way, by a long, soft road, toward asking her something he did not quite like to ask directly. What he wanted, when at last it came out, was the great clock. The clock had stopped, Mr. Coyle said. Some 15 months since, it had not been suffered to run since, and it was the earnest wish of certain persons who had the true interest of the estate at heart, Mr. Coyle said, choosing the words like a man, laying stepping stones across a bog, that the great clock should be got going again, quietly and quickly, and with as little disturbance to the household as could be managed, and that Miss Vaughan, who alone had the knowledge of its works, should be the one to do it. And Adelia Vaughan, sitting in the steward's warm office with her untouched wine, asked the one plain question that the smooth man had spent half an hour not answering, which was why the great clock had stopped, and why, if the family wished it going, it had been left standing silent for 15 months, and whether the Duke of Wexmore, whose clock it was, had sent for her. And at that the steward's watching eyes flickered, and he was quiet a moment, and then he said, in a lower and more careful voice, that these were in truth delicate matters, and that Miss Vaughn had best understand the house she had come into before she went further. And he told her, at last, in the guarded half-sentences of a man who fears to be overheard even in his own room, the thing the morning servants had not told her on the road. The Duke of Wexmore, Miss Coyle said, had married, some 4 years past, a lady of great beauty, the Lady Rosamond, and had loved her, the steward said, beyond what was quite wise in a man of his rank and reserve, had loved her the way that grave, silent men do love, wholly and inwardly, and without a word of it shown to the world. And 15 months since, in the November of the year before last, the young Duchess had died, of a fever that took her in a single dreadful week, in her own bed in the hall, and she had died, the steward said. And here he dropped his voice, until Adelia had to lean to hear him, at 7 minutes past midnight, on the 9th of November, and the Duke, Mr. Coyle said, had that same night, before his wife was cold, gone through the whole of Wexmore Hall with his own hands, from the great clock in the tower to the little watch on his own fob, and had stopped every clock in the house, all of them, the 200 years of clocks that a house like Wexmore gathers, and had set the hands of every one of them to 7 minutes past midnight, and had commanded, in a voice no one in the household had dared to disobey, that they should never be wound, nor moved, nor started again, and that the great tower clock above all should stand silent, so that time at Wexmore should stop, the Duke had said, at the minute it had stopped for him. And that, Mr. Coyle said, had been 15 months ago, and the clocks of Wexmore had stood at 7 minutes past midnight ever since, in a house of stopped clocks and drawn blinds where the Duke lived shut away and saw almost no one. And the great tower clock, the pride of the North, the 300-year promise her father had renewed, stood dead above the silent house with its golden hands frozen near the 12. Adelia Vaughn sat very still in the steward's office and felt the whole strange sorrow of it settle on her, and asked, quietly, "Then whose wish is it, Mr. Coyle, that I set the great clock going again, if it is the Duke's own command that it stands still? For you have not, I think, told me that it is the Duke who sends for me." And there was a silence, and in the silence Adelia understood that she had put her finger on the very thing the smooth man had spent an hour walking around. And Mr. Coyle looked at her with his watching eyes and seemed to weigh her. And then he said, in a voice gone quieter still, that she was a shrewd young woman, and he would deal plainly with her, because he would need her help, and it were better she knew the ground. The Duke, Mr. Coyle said, had a cousin, Mr. Julian Hale, the son of the old Duke's younger brother, who was, failing sons of the Duke's own body, and the Duke had no child, the heir presumptive to the whole of Wexmore, the title and the hall and the great estate together. And Mr. Hale, the steward said, his careful voice growing careful in a new way, had been much at the hall this past year, having taken it upon himself, out of family feeling, he said. And here something moved at the corner of the steward's mouth that was not quite a smile, to concern himself with the management of an estate whose master had let the reins fall from his hands. And it was Mr. Hale's view, which Mr. Hale did not scruple to make known, that his cousin the Duke, shut up these 15 months among his stopped clocks and his drawn blinds, refusing all company and all business, letting a great estate drift, sitting in the dark keeping the anniversary of a single minute, was a man whose grief had passed the bounds of sorrow and become a sickness of the mind, a man, Mr. Hale said, no longer fit to have the governance of himself or of the vast concerns that hung upon him. And Mr. Hale had begun, the steward said, and now his voice was very low indeed, to speak of a commission, of laying the matter before the proper authority, of having his poor afflicted cousin examined by physicians and by a jury of the neighborhood, and if they found as Mr. Hale was confident they must find, declared a lunatic, and the care of his person and the management of his whole estate committed, as the law in such cases provided, to his nearest kinsman, which was to say to Mr. Julian Hale himself. And Adelia Vaughn, listening, felt the cold of it go through her, and saw the shape of the thing entire, and understood at last why a stopped clock should matter so much to so many people, and why she had been sent for in secret. And she said, slowly, "So the stopped clocks are the proof, Miss Coyle. A house where every clock stands frozen at the minute of a death, and has stood so for 15 months by the master's own command. That is what Mr. Hale will show the physicians and the jury. That is the madness he means them to see. And if the great clock, the famous clock, the clock the whole county knows, could be got quietly going again before the commission comes, then the strongest single proof of the Duke's derangement is taken out of Mr. Hale's hand." And the steward looked at her with his watching eyes and said, softly, that she understood the matter very well, better and quicker than he had looked for, and that it was so that if the great clock were going when the gentleman came, it would go very hard with Mr. Hale's case. And Adelia said, "And does the Duke know that you have sent for me? And does the Duke consent that his own command be undone and his clock set going?" And the steward was silent again, and in his silence was her answer. And Adelia rose from her chair. She said, "Mr. Coyle, I am my father's daughter, and I know the worth of the clock in that tower better than any soul now living, and there is nothing on this earth I would more gladly do than set it beating again, for it half broke my heart to see its hands stopped from the drive. But I will not go up into that tower and undo a grieving man's dearest command behind his back, not to save his estate, not to spite his cousin, not for any wage you can name, because a clock set going by a trick against its master's will is a lie in brass, and my father did not raise me to tell lies in brass. If the great clock of Wexmore is to run again, it will run, because the Duke of Wexmore, in his own mind and of his own will, chooses to let time move again in his house, and if he cannot yet choose it, then all the physicians and juries in England may come, and I will not be the one to steal his grief from him while his back is turned." And she asked to be shown where she was to sleep, for the hour was late, and she would give the steward her answer on the morrow. But her true answer, she thought, she had already given, and she went up to the small, clean room they gave her high in the west front, near the tower, with a fire lit against the February cold, and she stood a long while at the window in the dark, looking up at the black bulk of the clock tower against the stars, and thought of a grave, dark young man who had once stood aside on a stair to let her pass, and of the same man now shut alone in this vast house of stopped clocks keeping, minute by minute for 15 months, the exact hour of the worst thing that had ever happened to him. And she found that her quarrel was not with him at all, and that under her refusal to be Mr. Coyle's instrument there was another feeling entirely, which was that she wanted, more than she had wanted anything since her father died, to go up into that tower and lay her hands on the great cold movement she knew like her own heart, and to go to the man in the dark house, not behind his back but to his face, and tell him what her father had told her, that it is a poor sort of world that lets the promises run down. She met the Duke of Wexmore by accident and against all the steward's arrangements, in the deep of that first night, and it was the great clock that brought them together, or rather the memory of it, for Adelia could not sleep. She lay in the small room near the tower, with the fire fallen to embers, and the whole vast silent house pressing on her, a house without the sound she had slept in every night of her life. For there is no house so silent as a house full of stopped clocks, no quiet so total as the quiet where ticking ought to be. And she found at last that she could not bear it, and rose and dressed and took her candle, meaning to go up to the tower chamber, only to stand outside the door of it, only to be near the great movement she had loved at 16. And she went up the winding stone stair of the west tower in her shawl with her candle in the terrible silence, and came out at the top into the stone clock chamber, and found that the door stood open and that she was not alone. There was a man in the clock chamber. He stood in the dark with his back to her before the great silent movement. A tall man in a dark dressing gown, holding up a branch of candles to the frozen face of the clock, and he was so lost in his looking that he did not hear her on the stair. And Adelia stopped in the doorway with her heart in her throat, because she knew before he turned, before she had seen his face, exactly who it was. For the whole chamber bent around his stillness the way a room bends around the single person in it who is in pain. He turned at the small sound of her breath, and the candles showed her the grave, dark young man of the stair, grown 7 years older and a lifetime sadder, tall and strongly made and gone gaunt with grief, dark hair untidy and threaded early with gray, a hard, fine face plowed deep with a sorrow he had long since stopped troubling to hide, and eyes of so dark a gray they were nearly black, set deep, that fixed on the strange young woman in the doorway of his private grief with a flat, cold anger. He asked her, in a low, rough, unused voice, who she was and what she did in his tower at such an hour, and Adelia, who might have quailed, found instead that the sight of the great clock behind him and the memory of her father steadied her, and she set down her candle on the stone sill and made him a plain curtsy and said that she was Adelia Vaughan, the daughter of Elias Vaughan, the clockmaker, who with her father had rebuilt the great clock behind him 7 years before, and that his steward had sent for her upon a matter of that clock, and that she could not sleep in a house so silent, and had come up, foolishly, only to be near the old movement she had loved as a girl, and that she asked his pardon for the trespass, and would go. And she saw, at her father's name and at the naming of the clock, something move in the hard, cold face, some crack across the settled grief, and the Duke of Wexmore stood a long moment looking at her in the candlelight, and then he said, in a different voice, lower still, that he remembered her, that he remembered a clockmaker and a girl of 16 who had lived a whole autumn in the tower when he was a young man and his father living, that he had passed her once upon the stair. And Adelia said, yes, your grace, you stood aside to let me by, and inclined your head to me as though I had been a lady, and I have not forgotten it in 7 years. And something in the saying of it, the small true human thing spoken plainly in that chamber of frozen time, seemed to reach the man where all the steward's schemes and all the cousin's threats had not. And the Duke of Wexmore set down his branch of candles on the great clock's stone base and put his hand flat against the cold, silent movement, and said, in the voice of a man speaking to himself in the dark, that she had come then to start it, that Coyle had sent for her to start it, that they all wanted it started. The steward and the cousin and the whole watching county wanted the clock going and the blinds up and the Duke of Wexmore out among them behaving as though a man may lose the half of his own soul on the 9th of November and then, decently after a season, wind himself up again and go on. And Adelia Vaughan looked at the grieving man with his hand on the clock she loved and did the thing her father had bred in her, which was to tell the exact truth in a plain voice. And she said, no, your grace, your steward sent for me to start it, that is true, and to start it secretly, behind your back, before your cousin's commission comes, And I told your steward this evening that I would not go up into this tower and undo your own dearest command while your back was turned, not to save your estate, not to spite your cousin, not for any wage he could name, because a clock set going by a trick against its master's will is a lie in brass. And my father did not raise me to tell lies in brass. And the Duke turned and stared at her, for it was plainly the last thing he had looked to hear from the clockmaker's daughter Coil had sent for, and Adelia went on, quietly, in the candle-lit dark, and I will tell you what I did not tell your steward, because you are the master of the clock, and he is not, and you have the right of it, and he has not. My father died 9 days into this January, of the lung fever, and I sat by him at the end, and the last thing he said to me, in the last thread of his voice, was about clocks, he said. Keep the good ones going, Della, whatever else you must let go. A clock is a promise a man makes to the time he will not live to see, and it is a poor sort of world that lets the promises run down. And I have thought since I came up this stair and saw your great clock standing dead, that there is a promise stopped in this tower 300 years old, older than your grief, sir, older than your house's grief 100 times over, a promise made by a Duke of Wexmoor in the first Queen Elizabeth's day, and kept by every clockmaker and every master of this house from that day to your own fathers, that has run through plagues and wars and the deaths of everyone who ever loved it, and it is stopped now, in your tower, on the minute of one woman's death, and I do not say you were wrong to stop it. For I have never lost what you have lost, and I will not sit in judgment on your grief, but I will say that it is a very great promise to have stopped, and that somewhere your lady, who I am told you loved past wisdom, and your father, who loved this clock as a living thing, are perhaps not best honored by the stopping of it. And then Adelia was afraid she had gone too far, for the Duke's face had shut like a door, and he said, coldly, that she knew nothing of it, nothing of his wife, nothing of what it was to walk through a house in which every clock was a knife, because every clock said the same thing, that the minute was past, that the day of her death was going away from him into the past faster and faster, that soon it would be a year gone, and then 2, and then 10, and that the one thing he could not endure, the single thing, was to stand and watch the hands carry her further from him with every tick, and that he had stopped the clocks so that he need not watch it, so that at Wexmoor, at least, in his own house, it should always be the minute she died, and she should never be more than 1 minute gone. And his rough voice broke on it, and he turned his face from her to the dark. And Adelia Vaughan, standing in the cold tower, with the tears standing in her own eyes, understood the whole of him then, the grief and the logic of the grief, the terrible sense it made, and she did not argue with it, because you cannot argue a person out of a grief that deep any more than you can argue a clock into running with its mainspring broke. She said only, softly, into the dark where he had turned his face, that she understood him better than he might think, for she had wound every clock in her father's workshop the night he died, all 40 of them, because she could not yet bear to let them stop, and had gone on winding them for a month until the creditors made her let them go, and that she knew, none better, the comfort of the stopped hand and the wound spring, the wish to hold the world at the minute before the loss became real. But she said, and here she chose her words as her father would have chosen them, laying them down like stepping stones, "There is a thing I learned in that month, sir, winding my father's clocks against the truth. And it is this, that a stopped clock does not keep the hour of the death. It keeps the death itself. It does not hold her here. It holds you there, at the minute she went. forever, and will not let you come away, and a wound clock that is not suffered to run is not a memory. It is a grave you dig again every single day. And the great clock of Wexmore, sir, is not a grave. It was never a grave. It was made to tell a living house the turning of the living heavens, the moon and the planets and the coming round of the seasons. And it is telling them still, in there, in the stopped brass, wanting only to be let go on. And I think, though it is not my place to think it, that when you are ready, not tonight, and not for me, and not for your steward or your cousin or the county, but for yourself and for her, the kindest thing and the bravest thing you will ever do will be to come up into this tower and lay your own hand to the great weight and let time begin again in your house. And I think until you can do that of your own will, no one should do it for you, and I will not. And when you can, you will not need me, for you will only have to let it run. And she took up her candle and made him her plain curtsy again, and left him alone in the tower with the stopped clock, and went down the winding stair, and did not know, as she lay awake the rest of that night, that the Duke of Wexmore stood in the cold chamber until the gray came in at the tower windows, with his hand on the silent movement, hearing, over and over, the clockmaker's daughter say, "It is not a grave. It was never a grave." She did not leave Wexmore in the morning as she had meant to. She was sent for, instead, before she had finished dressing, not by the steward but by the Duke, and she came down to a small book-lined room where he received her. Shaved and dressed and formal now, the grief banked down behind the grave courtesy, and he told her, without preamble, that he had thought upon what she had said, and that he was not ready, as she had rightly guessed, to do the thing she spoke of, but that he found he did not wish her to go, that he would be plain with her as she had been plain with him, that his cousin Julian meant to have him declared mad and to take the estate, and that the stopped clocks were the heart of it, and that he had thought all these months that he did not care, that they might call him mad and take the lands, and welcome, for what were lands, but that she had said a thing in the tower that had lodged in him about promises let run down, and that he found he did care after all about one thing, which was that the great clock, his father's clock, the 300-year promise, should not be made into a weapon against him by a man who cared nothing for it and would as soon sell it to a scrap founder as look at it. For Julian Hale, the Duke said, had once, as a boy, been beaten by the old Duke for throwing stones at the tower dial, and had hated the clock ever since as only such a boy can hate the thing he has been punished for. And so the Duke made Adelia Vaughan an offer that was not the steward's offer. He did not ask her to start the clock. He asked her to stay, openly as what she was, a clockmaker, retained by him to survey and to tend the many clocks of Wexmore, the 200 years of stopped movements throughout the house, to clean and to true and to make ready without winding one of them, so that the clocks should be in health whenever their hour came, if it ever came, and to keep the great tower clock, above all, in such order that it might be started in an hour by a hand that chose to start it. And he said, looking at her with his dark, deep eyes, that he made her this offer partly, he would confess, because it suited him to have in the house against his cousin's commission an honest expert witness who could speak to the state of his clocks and his wits, but partly. And he said this more slowly, because in one night she had spoken to him more honestly than anyone had dared in 15 months, and because he found the house less unbearable for the thought of a person in it who had loved the clock as a girl, and had wound her own dead father's timepieces against the dark, and who would not lie to him, even in brass. And Adelia Vaughan accepted, And so began the strange grave months of her second season at Wexmore Hall. She worked, that late winter and early spring, the way her father had taught her, patiently and from the movement outward, going through the house clock by clock, 100 and more of them, and came to know Wexmore as few living souls knew it, the true inward life of the house. For a clock stands in every kind of room, and a clockmaker sees them all. She found the little clocks first, the bracket and mantel and long case clocks in the passages, each standing at 7 minutes past midnight, each a small death faithfully kept. And she cleaned and freed them, and set them in health, and did not wind them, and left each standing at the frozen minute as she had found it, so that the house remained, to any eye, exactly the house of stopped clocks it had been, but one that could now be brought to life in a single morning by a person with the will to do it. And as she worked, she learned the house's grief the way she learned its clocks, from the inside. She learned the late Duchess Rosamond not as the county had known her, the great beauty, but as the servants had loved her, from the housekeeper Mrs. Turnan, and from old Pruitt the butler, who had carried the young Duchess pick-a-back up these very stairs when she was a tired bride of 19, a laughing, warm, generous creature who had come into the grave, silent house and had, for 3 short years, thrown open its blinds and filled it with music and light, and loved her grave, silent husband exactly as much as he loved her. So that the marriage the county had thought a mismatch had been, behind the walls, the one warm thing at the heart of Wexmore. And when the fever took her in a single week, the light had gone out of the house as though a hand had snuffed it. And the Duke, who had loved in silence, grieved in silence, and stopped the clocks. And cleaning the little movements in the rooms where Rosamond had lived, Adelia understood that the man was not mad at all, only broken. And only broken because he had first been, for 3 years, more happy than a grave, reserved man had ever expected to be, and had not known how to bear the losing of a happiness he had never learned to trust while he had it. She saw the Duke most days, though never for long. He would come to wherever she was working, quietly, and stand a while and watch her hands at the small, precise labor, and say little, and go. And she understood that the sound of the work, the small, clean clockmaker's sounds in the silent house, the click of a freed wheel and the whisper of a cleaning brush, were a comfort to him that he could not have named, the first small, purposeful human sounds Wexmore had held in 15 months, and by degrees he came to stay longer, and to talk, and it was always at first of the clocks, for the clocks were safe, and then, because she never pressed him and never flinched, it came to be of other things. And one gray afternoon in the music room, watching her ease the movement out of the small clock by his dead wife's chair, he told her in a low, even voice about Rosamond, the first time he had spoken his wife's name aloud to another living soul since the 9th of November, and Adelia went on with her work and did not stop and did not exclaim, giving him the cover of the small sounds to do it under, and he talked, and it was the beginning of his coming back. She met the cousin in March, and she disliked him within the hour and feared him within the day. Mr. Julian Hale came up from London when the roads dried, and he came, he said, out of family duty, to see how his poor afflicted cousin did. And he was a handsome, florid man of 40, with a loud, confiding manner and quick, pale eyes that were forever counting the house, the plate, and the pictures, and the very paneling, the eyes, Adelia thought. Of a man walking through a shop he means shortly to own, and he was all warmth to the Duke's face, my dear Wexmore, my poor dear fellow, and all a different thing behind his back, and he took particular note, on the first evening, of the clockmaker's young woman at her work in the passages, and asked the steward about her in a voice not quite low enough, and Adelia heard, in that voice, that Mr. Julian Hale had understood at once what her presence in the house might mean to his design, and had marked her for an enemy. He came to speak to her the next day, alone, in the long gallery where she was working, all charm, praising her skill and her father's name, and he told her, as one reasonable person to another, that it was a sad thing to see a fine man like his cousin sunk so low in melancholy, and that those who truly loved the Duke must sometimes be cruel to be kind. And he said, watching her with his counting eyes, that he hoped Miss Vaughan was too sensible a young woman to do anything so rash as to start the great clock going against the settled state of the case, for it could do no good. The physicians and the jury would look at 15 months of a man's madness and not at one morning's clockwork. And a clock lately and cleverly set going by a hired tradeswoman would weigh nothing against the settled evidence of the Duke's derangement, and might be made to look like just such a desperate contrivance of interested persons as it would in truth be, so that Miss Vaughan, if she were wise, would keep to the little clocks she was paid for, and leave the great questions of the estate to those whose place it was to decide them. And Adelia Vaughan, who had been threatened more softly than this and not so softly, looked at the florid smiling man and understood that she had just been warned off, and understood, too, from the very vehemence of the warning, how much the starting of the great clock must in truth be feared by Mr. Julian Hale, whatever he said of its weighing nothing, and she answered him meekly that she was only a clockmaker and knew nothing of estates and juries, and would keep to her work, and she saw that he took the meekness for victory, as such men do, and went away satisfied, and she thought, watching him go, that a man does not trouble to frighten a person who cannot hurt him, and that she had learned more from his threat than he had meant to teach her. It was Mrs. Ternan, the housekeeper, who gave her the first hard fact under the smooth surface some days after, and gave it her frightened and low, having wrestled with herself over whether to speak, for the housekeeper had come to trust the clockmaker's daughter and to fear for the Duke. And she told Adelia a thing that had been troubling her, which was that Mr. Hale, on his visits this past year, had been much in the tower, alone, that he who had hated the clock as a boy now went up to the clock chamber by himself more than once and stayed, and came down saying nothing, and that once in the autumn she had gone up after him to call him to dinner, and had found him not looking at the clock as a man looks who admires it, but crouched at the back of the great movement with a light, doing something to it with his hands, and had drawn back before he saw her, and had told no one, for who was she to question the air, but that it had sat wrong with her ever since. Miss Hale, who hated the clock going up alone to handle its works in the dark. And Adelia Vaughan, hearing this, went cold, and then very still, and thanked the housekeeper. And that same afternoon she went up alone to the tower chamber, and lit her lamp, and did the thing she had not yet done in all her weeks at Wexmore. For she had tended the little clocks, and left the great one only surveyed and dusted, meaning not to open its heart until the Duke gave the word. But now she opened it. She took off her cuffs and pinned back her sleeves, and went into the great 300-year movement with her lamp and her father's loop, wheel by wheel and arbor by arbor, the whole vast familiar heart of it that she and her father had rebuilt 7 years before. And she went slowly, and she went thoroughly, and at the back of the movement, deep in the going train, where no eye would fall that was not looking, where a person coming to start the clock in a hurry would never think to look before he hauled on the great weights. She found it. Someone had been at the clock. Someone who knew a little. Not a clockmaker, but a man who had read enough to be dangerous, had done a small, patient, wicked thing, had filed, part way through, almost through, so that it would bear a light hand but never a working strain, the steel arbor of the great third wheel. The wheel that took the whole pull of the driving weight, had filed it and then rubbed the bright cut with grime and oil, so that it looked to a careless glance like old honest wear, so that the clock stood, as it was, harmless and still, and could be dusted and admired and found sound, but so that on the day someone wound it up and set the heavy weights to pull, the great clock would run, beautifully, for an hour, for two, for as long as it took to gather a crowd and a hope, and then, under the full strain, at the worst possible moment, the weakened arbor would shear clean through, and the driving weight would come down, and the whole 300-year movement would wreck itself in an instant, wheels and pinions and the priceless old brass smashing under the falling weight, ruined past any mending, dead forever. And any clockmaker who had wound it, any hired tradeswoman who had presumed to start the great clock of Wexmore against the wisdom of the family, would stand there in the wreck of the pride of the North as the woman whose meddling had destroyed it, the very picture of the desperate, interested contrivance Mr. Hale had smilingly described, and the ruin of the clock would be the ruin of the Duke. One more, the last and worst, proof of a household given over to reckless folly. Adelia Vaughn sat back on her heels in the tower chamber with the lamp in her hand and the filed arbor before her eyes, and understood that she was looking at a thing that had been meant, very possibly, to kill an old machine and a man's good name together, and that she had found it only because a frightened housekeeper had loved her master enough to speak, and because a clockmaker's daughter opens the heart of a clock before she trusts it, and she understood, kneeling there, that Mr. Julian Hale's whole smooth confidence, his certainty that the starting of the clock could do the Duke no good, rested on his knowledge that the clock, if started, would not run but wreck, and that his warning to her had not been a warning at all but a trap baited and set, an invitation almost to go ahead and start it and be destroyed. And she felt, rising in her under the fear, the same cold, steadying anger her father had felt before any plain wrong, and she made herself breathe and think and be a clockmaker. She went to the Duke that night, to his face, as was her way, and she asked him to come up to the tower, and he came. And by the light of her lamp she showed him what she had found, the filed arbor and the grime rubbed into the cut, and she explained it to him plainly, in words a man who was not a clockmaker could follow, what it was and what it had been meant to do, that the clock had been made into a trap, that it would run a while and then destroy itself and whoever had started it, and that it had been done, by the state of the grime and the housekeeper's account, some months since, by a hand that went up alone to the tower in the dark, and hated the clock. And she watched the Duke of Wexmore understand by degrees what he was being told, that his cousin had not merely schemed to use his grief, but had crept into the tower and laid a snare in the heart of his father's clock to wreck it and to damn him, and she saw the grief in the gaunt face burned clean, for a moment, by a pure and terrible anger, and then, which moved her more, she saw the anger give way to something else, to a kind of dreadful clarity, as though a man long under water had at last put his head into the air, and the Duke of Wexmore stood in the tower looking at the wound in his father's clock and said, in a voice quite changed, quite steady, that he had been a fool, that he had sat 15 months in the dark telling himself that nothing mattered, that they might take it all and welcome, and had let a man walk into his house and into his very tower and lay hands on the one thing his father had loved, because he, the Duke, had been too sunk in his own sorrow to guard it, and that his grief, which he had thought a private and a sacred thing, had been all this while a door left open, an invitation to every creeping, interested soul who saw a great estate with a broken man asleep at the head of it. And that Rosamond, he said, and it was the first time he had said her name to Adelia without his voice breaking, Rosamond would be ashamed of him. Not for grieving, she would never be ashamed of grief, but for lying down under it, and letting the promises run down. And Adelia Vaughn, hearing the man say it himself, the very words her father had given her, knew that something had turned in him that could not turn back, and she said, "Gently, then let us not let them run down, sir." And she told him her plan. She would mend the clock. She would forge, at the estate's own smithy, working at night, from the good steel she would send for, a new third-wheel arbor, true and whole and strong, exactly as her father had taught her, and she would fit it into the great movement in place of the filed and murdered one. And no living soul but the two of them and the housekeeper should know it had been done, not the steward, whom she did not wholly trust, and above all not Mr. Hale. And she would keep the ruined arbor, the filed one, wrapped and safe, with its wicked cut and its rubbed-in grime, as a thing that could be shown and sworn to. And then the great clock of Wexmore, whatever Mr. Hale believed, would be not a trap but a sound and honest clock again, that would run when it was started, and go on running for another 300 years, and it would be for the Duke, and for the Duke alone, to choose the hour of its starting. But when he chose it, it would not betray him, and, she said, looking at him steadily in the lamplight, when the commission comes, sir, as it will, and Mr. Hale stands up before the physicians and the jury and points to your stopped clocks as the proof of your madness, and waits, as I think he waits, hoping and half daring that in your defense someone will rashly start the great clock and wreck it and prove his case for him, then we shall be ready, and what happens in that hour shall be your choosing and not his, and it shall be the truth, and not a lie in brass. And so through the cold, bright nights of that March and April, while the house slept, Adelia Vaughn worked in the estate smithy, with old Pruitt keeping the door, and Mrs. Turnan keeping the secret, and she forged and turned and tempered a new arbor for the great third wheel, as her father had taught her, and the Duke came out to the smithy in the small hours more than once, and stood in the red forge light, and watched her work the steel. And they talked, in those nights as people talk who are building a thing together against a common enemy, freely and deep. And Adelia told him of her father and her strange upbringing to the trade, and the Duke told her of his boyhood in the great cold house, and his grave, undemonstrative father, and the bright 3 years of his marriage that had taught him, too late, that he had a heart. And of Rosamond, and Adelia, listening, found that the thing she had felt on the tower stair at 16 and been ashamed of, the warmth that had come into her face at a Marcus's courtesy, had never quite gone out in 7 years, and was now, in the forge light, kindling into something she had no business feeling and could not help, and she was too honest not to name it to herself, that she had come to love the Duke of Wexmore, and too sensible not to know the folly of it, a penniless clockmaker's daughter loving a duke, and too proud to let one sign of it show, and so she banked it down as he had once banked his grief, and worked her steel, and gave no sign, and only her work grew, if it were possible, more perfect, because she was making the thing for him. And she did not know that the Duke, watching her grave, absorbed face in the forge light, was banking down thoughts of his own, telling himself that a man 15 months a widower had no right to the feeling that had crept into him in the tower and grown in the smithy, and would be the worst of the interested souls who circled his house if he let a young woman in his own pay see it. And so the two of them worked side by side through the spring nights, each in love and each in silence, each certain the other could not possibly feel the same, which is the oldest and sweetest folly in the world, and the one that clocks who see everything are most patient with. The new arbor was made and fitted by the middle of April, the great movement whole again and sound, standing still and silent to every eye exactly as before, at 7 minutes past midnight, but now a clock that would run true if ever a hand were laid to it, and the filed and murdered arbor lay wrapped in oiled cloth in the bottom of Adelia's workbox, with its wicked half-cut and its rubbed grime, waiting, and it was well the work was done. For at the end of that month the blow they had been waiting for fell, and it fell hard. For Mr. Julian Hale, grown impatient and confident, moved at last, and a formal notice came to the Duke that a commission in the nature of a writ de lunatico inquirendo had been sued out and granted, that certain of His Majesty's commissioners, with 2 physicians and a jury of 22 substantial men of the county, would attend at Wexmore Hall upon a day named to inquire whether the Duke of Wexmore were of sound mind and capable of the government of himself and his estate, or whether he were a lunatic, and the government ought to be committed to another. And the day named, the day the county was summoned to come and sit in judgment on whether the Duke of Wexmore was mad, was the 9th of November. The 9th of November. Mr. Julian Hale, whether by the cold cleverness Adelia now credited him with, or by the mere ugly chance of the legal calendar, had contrived that the Duke should be examined for his sanity upon the 1st anniversary, but one of his wife's death, the very day whose minute the whole house of clocks stood frozen upon, the worst day in the Duke's year, the day when his grief would be rawest, and his stopped clocks loudest, and his fitness to govern himself most open to doubt. And Adelia, when she understood it, thought that if she had wanted one proof more of Mr. Hale's cruelty she had it now, that he had set the trial of the Duke's reason on the anniversary of the wound to his reason, meaning the day itself to do half his work. And she understood too, and it steadied her, that the same terrible date which Mr. Hale meant for a weapon might, if a brave hand turned it, be made into something else altogether. For there is no day on which the starting of a stopped clock means more than the very day it was stopped. They made their preparations quietly through the last weeks of autumn, and the Duke, now that he was awake, proved a formidable ally, and set his own honest lawyers, whom the steward did not control, to look into Mr. Julian Hale's affairs in London. And what they found was very much what Adelia had suspected from the counting eyes, that Mr. Hale was a man drowning in debt, whose sudden family feeling and year of tender visits dated with a wonderful exactness from the season his own ruin had become certain, so that the man who came to declare his cousin unfit to govern an estate could not himself govern his own household, and had need of Wexmore, and soon or be undone. And Adelia kept the ruined arbor safe, and kept the great clock's health a secret, and the Duke, at her counsel, gave out no sign that anything at Wexmore had changed, but let his cousin and the county and the whole watching country go on believing that the 9th of November would find at the hall exactly what Mr. Hale had promised them, a broken recluse among his frozen clocks, and only within the house, and only among the 3 or 4 who could be trusted, did the truth grow, that the Duke of Wexmore meant to meet his cousin's commission not as a prisoner in the dock of his own grief, but as a man defending, with every faculty entire, the house and the name and the great clock his fathers had left him. The 9th of November came gray and still and cold, a hard white frost on the gardens and the dale lying under a low pearl sky, and the county came up the long drive to Wexmore in its carriages as it had come, Adelia thought, to that other house in that other story, to see how the sad business of a great family would end. For Mr. Hale, in his confidence, had made no secret of the commission and had let it be widely known, expecting, as such men do, a public triumph, so that besides the commissioners and the 2 physicians and the 22 jurymen there, came half the neighborhood, the squires and the parsons and the magistrates and their wives, filling the great hall of Wexmore where the examination was to be held.
80 and more of them come to witness the declaring of a Duke a lunatic, and Mr.
Julian Hale moved among them, florid and gracious and grave, the very picture of a kinsman sorrowing over a painful duty, and did not know, going up and down the great hall, being sorry in a loud confidential voice, that at the top of the west tower above his head the murdered heart of the clock beat sound and whole and waiting, and that the clockmaker's daughter he had smilingly warned off in the spring had spent the small hours of that very morning in the tower with her lamp, checking every wheel and pinion of the great movement one last time, and hanging the great driving weights on their gut lines ready, and setting all in order so that the clock, which stood still at 7 minutes past midnight, wanted now only one thing to wake it and to run, which was a hand laid to the pendulum and a heart that chose to let time move. The examination began at noon. The chief commissioner, a dry, precise, elderly gentleman named Sergeant Marchmont, sat at a great table at the head of the hall with the 2 physicians beside him and the jury ranged along one side. And Mr. Hale's counsel opened the case, and it was, Adelia had to own, well done and cruel, for the man had only to tell the plain truth and let it damn, and he told it. The 15 months of seclusion, the drawn blinds, the great estate left to drift, and, above all and returning to it again and again as the black heart of the whole matter, the clocks of Wexmore, every one of them stopped by the Duke's own command on the night of his wife's death, and kept frozen at the 1 minute, 7 minutes past midnight, a whole great house in which time itself had been forbidden to move by the deranged will of a man who could not accept his wife was dead. And he offered to take the commissioners through the house and show them the stopped clocks with their own eyes, and up, last of all, to the great tower, to the famous clock of Wexmore, the pride of the North, standing dead these 15 months by the Duke's mad command, and the county listened, and looked at the gaunt, gray, silent Duke sitting motionless through it all, and Adelia, watching from among the servants at the side of the hall, saw the neighbors' faces and knew that the case was working, that they believed it, that a house full of clocks all stopped at the minute of a death was a thing that needed no physician to interpret, and that if it were left there, the Duke was lost. And then the Duke of Wexmore was invited to answer, and he rose, and the hall went very still. For a man on trial for his reason is a fearful thing to watch stand up and speak, and there was not one soul in that hall save 3, who did not expect to see the broken recluse stammer and break down and prove the case against himself with every word. And instead the Duke of Wexmore stood straight and looked down the crowded hall with his deep, dark eyes quite clear and quite steady, and spoke in a low, even carrying voice, and said that he would not deny one fact his cousin's counsel had stated, for every one of them was true, that he had shut himself away, and drawn the blinds, and let the business of the estate fall, and that yes, on the night his wife died, he had gone through his house and stopped every clock in it with his own hands, and set them all to the minute of her death, and forbidden that they be started, and had kept them so for 15 months. All of that was true, the Duke said, and he was not ashamed of it, for it was grief, and grief is not madness, though a man may be forgiven, he said, looking without expression at his cousin, for wishing to make the one appear the other when a great estate hangs upon it, And he said that he stood before them today to say that his grief, though it had laid him low a long while, had not unseated his reason, and that he would prove it to them, not with words, for any madman may protest his sanity with words, but with an act, done before them all, of his own free will, that a madman could not do. And he asked the commissioners' leave that the whole company should go up, now, to the great tower, to the famous stopped clock of Wexmore. The very clock his cousin's council had named as the blackest proof of his madness, for he had something to do there, in their sight, that would answer the whole charge. And the commissioners, after a murmured consultation, and not a little curious, gave leave, and Mr. Julian Hale, Adelia saw, went up to the tower among the crowd with a face gone suddenly less certain, for this was not the broken, passive victim of his plan, and a small worm of doubt had begun to work in him. But he mastered it, and Adelia read his mastering of it, and understood what he was telling himself, that let his cousin play what mad scene he liked in the tower, the clock could do him no good, for the clock was a trap, and if the fool meant to start it before them all, why, so much the better. Let him start it, and let it run its hour, and then wreck itself and its master's name together in the sight of the whole county, and save Mr. Hale the trouble. And Adelia, catching the ugly flicker of returning confidence in the florid face, knew that Mr. Hale still believed the arbor filed and the clock a snare. And she felt her own heart begin to beat hard and high, for the whole of it now turned on a thing that only she and two others knew. They crowded into the great stone clock chamber at the top of the west tower, as many as could press in, the commissioners and the physicians and the jury and the county together, into the cold high chamber where the 300-year movement stood 2 stories tall in its frame of blackened oak and silvered dials, its golden hands frozen at 7 minutes past midnight, and the low pearl light of the November afternoon came in at the tower windows. And the Duke of Wexmore stood before the clock of his fathers with the whole county at his back, and Adelia Vaughn came to stand quietly at his side, and Mr. Hale's counsel objected sharply to the presence of the tradeswoman, and the Duke said, without turning, that Miss Vaughn was the one person living who knew the inside of this clock, having rebuilt it with her father, and that she was there at his desire, and would remain. And the commissioner allowed it, and the Duke of Wexmore turned to the great movement, and did not, as every soul in that chamber expected, reach at once for the pendulum to start it. Instead, he said, in his clear, even voice, that before he started the clock, as he meant to, there was a thing the commission ought to see, for it went to the very question of who in that room was of sound mind and honest purpose, and who was not. And he asked Miss Vaughn to show the gentleman what she had found in the heart of the clock some 7 months since. And Adelia Vaughn stepped forward, and from her workbox she took the wrapped and oiled cloth, and unwrapped it, and held up, in the cold light of the tower, the murdered arbor, the filed steel, with its wicked cut 3 parts through, and its rubbed in grime. And she explained it to the commissioners and the 2 physicians in her plain, clear clockmaker's voice. What it was, the arbor of the great third wheel that took the whole pull of the driving weight, and what had been done to it, filed almost through and the cut disguised, and what it had been made to do, which was to let the clock run an hour or 2, and then shear under the strain and bring the great weight down and wreck the whole 300-year movement past mending, and to ruin, along with it, the name of anyone who had presumed to start the clock. And she told them where she had found it, deep in the going train where no eye falls that is not searching. And she told them, for the housekeeper had agreed to swear to it, that Mrs. Ternan of the household had seen Mr. Julian Hale go up alone into this tower more than once in the past year, and had once found him crouched at the back of this very movement with a light, working at it with his hands. Miss Hale, who by his own family's account had hated this clock since boyhood. And she said, holding up the filed arbor so the low light caught the bright wicked cut of it, that she was a clockmaker and the daughter of a clockmaker, and that she would swear on her father's grave and before God and this commission that this cut was made by a hand and a file within the 12-month, and was no honest wear, and that the man who made it knew that whoever wound this clock would destroy it, and meant them too. And the great clock chamber went utterly silent, and then began to fill with a low-growing murmur, and every face in it turned, slowly, all together, from the filed steel in the clockmaker's hand to the florid, handsome face of Mr. Julian Hale, which had gone, in the cold light of the tower, the gray white of tallow, for it was borne in upon the whole company at once, commissioners and physicians and jury and county together, the shape of the thing, that the man who had come to prove his cousin a madman for keeping a clock stopped had himself crept into the tower and ruined the clock's heart, so that it should destroy itself if ever it were started, and that the same man's confidence that the starting of the clock could do the Duke no good had rested all along on his secret knowledge that the clock, if started, would wreck, and Mr. Hale, feeling the whole chamber turn against him, lost his head, as such men do at the last, and cried out that it was a lie, a contrivance, a piece of filed steel the woman might have made in any smithy and brought in her box, that it proved nothing, that they should not take the word of a hired tradeswoman against a gentleman and the heir of the house, and it was the wrong thing to say, and it was the Duke of Wexmore who answered it, quietly, and finished him. For the Duke said that Mr. Hale was quite right, that a filed arbor in a box proved nothing by itself, and that there was but one way to prove the matter beyond the reach of any man's word, and that was the way he had meant to take from the first. That if the clock had been left a trap, as Miss Vaughan said, then it would wreck when it was started, and Mr. Hale would be proved a slanderer and the Duke a madman, and Mr. Hale should have his estate, but that if the clock ran sound and true and went on running, then it had been made whole by an honest hand, and the filed arbor was no fantasy but a thing truly taken out of it, and every man in the room might draw his own conclusion as to who had put it there. And, said the Duke, turning from his ashen cousin to the great movement, there is no better hour than this to learn the truth of it. And he laid his hand upon the great clock. And here Adelia Vaughan's part was done, and the Duke's began. For they had agreed that the last act should be his and his alone, since it was his grief the whole thing turned upon, and his hand that had stopped the clock, and his hand therefore that must start it, and the Duke of Wexmore, before the whole county, in the cold high tower on the anniversary of his wife's death, reached up to the great silver dial, and, with a hand that Adelia saw was not quite steady, moved the golden hands of the clock forward off the frozen minute, off 7 minutes past midnight, where they had stood for 15 months, and set them true to the hour the pearl light told. And then he bent to the base of the movement and freed the great pendulum, the long burnished rod as tall as a man, and drew it to one side, and held it a moment, and Adelia saw his lips move, and knew, though she could not hear it, that he was saying his wife's name. And then the Duke of Wexmore let the pendulum go, and the great clock of Wexmore woke. The long pendulum swung down and across and back, and the escapement caught it with the slow, deep, authoritative talk that Adelia had first heard on a November midnight 7 years before, the pulse of the house resuming, and the whole 300-year movement, sound and whole and true upon its new honest arbor, took up its beat and began, before the eyes and under the hands of the whole county, to run, the great wheels turning, the silvered moon on its dial stirring toward its climb, time itself, forbidden 15 months, moving again in the house of Wexmore, and the deep, slow talk, talk, talk filled the stone chamber, and Adelia Vaughn stood with the tears running down her face and did not care who saw them. And old Pruitt by the door was weeping openly. And the county, 80 of them, stood in the cold tower and listened to the pride of the North beat again, and understood, every one, that no trap had wrecked it, that the clock ran sound, that the filed arbor was true and the man who had filed it was among them, gray-faced by the wall. And then, because a clock once started keeps its own appointments, the great movement gathered itself, and the hour it had been set to came round, and above their heads in the bell chamber the huge old bell of Wexmore, silent 15 months, swung and struck once, and again a great bronze note that went out over the frosted dale for the first time in more than a year, and was heard, they said afterward, in the town, where people stopped in the streets and looked up at the tower and said the Wexmore clock was going again, the Duke's clock, and did not know what it meant. Only that a sound the country had missed without quite knowing it had come back. And in the tower the bell struck out the hour over the heads of the commissioners and the jury and the ruined cousin, and it was, Adelia thought, the most complete answer to a charge of madness that any court could ever have been given. For there is nothing saner in all the world than a great old clock keeping true time, and the Duke of Wexmore had made his defense not in words, but in bronze and steel, and it could not be gainsaid. The commissioners did not take long. Sergeant Marchmont, when the bell had done and the deep talk of the movement filled the quiet, conferred a few low minutes with the two physicians, and then said, dryly, that a man who had, in the face of a hostile examination, detected a felony worked upon his property, preserved the proof of it, repaired the injury by the hand of a skilled artificer, and then, of his own free and deliberate will, set going and regulated one of the most intricate machines in the north of England, had answered the charge of madness more completely than any physician's report could do, that he found no want of reason in the Duke of Wexmore whatever, but on the contrary a very clear one, that the grief urged as madness was no more than the grief of a man who had greatly loved, and no bar to his capacity, and that the commission would be dismissed, and its costs, he added, looking coldly at the gray-faced heir, would be a matter for further inquiry, along with the graver question of who had laid a felonious hand upon the clock, for that was a matter no longer for a commission of lunacy, but for the assizes. And Mr. Julian Hale did not wait for the assizes. He left Wexmore that same afternoon while the county still stood marveling in the tower, and left the county within the week, and went abroad, where his creditors and the questions about the filed arbor could not easily follow, and was heard of afterward only distantly, and never well. And it is the ordinary end of men who would rather smash a beautiful old thing than see another man keep it, that they die at last owning nothing beautiful, and nothing old, and nothing kept. But that was afterward. On the day itself there was the great clock beating in the tower, and the county going home with more to talk of than it had come for, and the early dark coming down, and then there was the quiet of the house, with the wonderful new old sound in it. The ticking everywhere, for the Duke had gone through Wexmore that evening with his own hands as he had once gone through it to stop the clocks, and had started them, all of them, the bracket clocks and the mantel clocks and the long case clocks in the passages, every one that Adelia had cleaned and freed and left standing at the frozen minute, and set them all to the true hour, and wound them and let them run, so that the house of stopped clocks became, in one evening, a house full of the small living sound of time, 100 clocks ticking in the dark, and the Duke of Wexmoor stood in his great hall and listened to his house be alive again, and found Adelia Vaughn there, listening too. He came and stood beside her in the ticking dark, and for a while neither spoke. And then the Duke of Wexmoor said that he had a thing to say and small skill in saying it. He said that 15 months ago he had stopped every clock in this house because he could not bear to watch time carry his wife away from him, and that he had believed, until a clockmaker's daughter came up his tower stair one sleepless night, that the stopping of the clocks was love, the last love he had to give her, and that Adelia had shown him, that night and every day since, that it had not been love at all, but only fear, and that a stopped clock does not keep the beloved near, it keeps the mourner prisoner, and that she had given him back, along with his father's clock and his good name and his estate, the thing he had thrown away, which was time itself, the going on of days, the permission to live, and that a man to whom another person has given back his life is in a difficulty. For there is only one gift large enough to offer in return, and he was almost afraid to name it, knowing what he was, a duke, and what she was, a clockmaker's daughter in his own pay, and knowing what the world would say. And Adelia Vaughn, standing in the ticking dark with her heart going harder than any clock in the house, said, in the plain voice her father had bred in her, that she cared nothing for what the world would say, having been looked down upon by the world her whole life and found its opinion worth very little, but that there was one thing she must say before he said any more, in honesty, because she had never yet told him a lie and would not begin with the most important thing, and she told him that she had loved him, a little, since she was 16 years old and he had stood aside on a stair to let a clockmaker's girl go by and bowed his head to her as though she were a lady, and that she had loved him a great deal since the night on the tower stair, and had banked it down and told herself it was folly, and had made his father's clock whole in the forged light, in the small hours, loving him the whole time and certain he could never feel the same, and that if he had been about to say what she thought he had been about to say, then he need not be afraid to say it. For the answer had been ready in her for 7 years. And the Duke of Wexmoor took the clockmaker's daughter's 2 hands in his in the dark hall full of the sound of running clocks, and said her name, only her name, Adelia, as though it were the answer to everything. And it was. And above them in the tower, the great clock of Wexmoor kept its deep, slow time over the 2 of them and over the whole waking house, promising, as it had promised for 300 years, and would promise for 300 more, all the time in the world. They were married in the spring, in Wexmoor Church, and the county came, all of it, and looked at the clockmaker's daughter going up the aisle on the Duke's arm, and did not, this time, whisper that she was beneath him, because it had stood in his tower on the 9th of November and seen, with its own eyes, exactly what she was worth, and she was Duchess of Wexmoor for 40 years, and they were, by every account that has come down, 40 good years, and she never in all of them lost the trick of her trade, but kept the great clock herself, and every clock in the house, going true, and taught her own children, the sons and the daughters both, to strip and clean a movement before they were grown. Because, she told them, a clock is a promise a man makes to the time he will not live to see, and it is a poor sort of world that lets the promises run down. So let me leave you there, in the ticking house above the frosted dale, and ask you the thing I have been turning over since I first sat down to tell it. This is a story about a man who tried to stop time because he could not bear to let it carry away the one he loved, and about a woman who taught him that the stopping of the clock is not the keeping of the love, but only the keeping of the wound, and that the bravest thing grief is ever asked to do is to let the hands move again. Most of us have a clock somewhere we have stopped, a room we keep as it was, a day we will not let ourselves come away from, a minute past midnight we go back and back to, and there is no shame in it, for it is only love that does not know yet how to go on. But I have come to believe, telling stories like this one to you in the dark, that the dead are not best honored by the stopping of the clocks, that the ones who loved us would not have us stand forever at the minute we lost them, that they would rather, far rather, hear the house tick on, and the bell strike, and the living go about the business of living, carrying them along not as a wound kept open but as a promise kept going. So tell me before you go, what is the clock you have stopped, and whether the time has come gently and in your own hour, and for no one but yourself, to lay your hand to the pendulum and let it move. And tell me, too, where you are listening from tonight, and what the weather is doing there, and whether the clocks in your own house are running. Because I ask everyone, and I read everyone. And now, one last picture before you go. A long gray house above a frosted dale in the last of the November light, and its 100 windows glowing gold at last. And high on the west tower the great clock of Wexmore beating out the hour into the cold, clear air, its golden hands moving, its bell swinging, its silvered moon climbing the dial as it was made to climb. And inside, in the warm, ticking dark, a tall, grave man and a clockmaker's daughter standing hand in hand and listening, at last unafraid, to the sound of time going on, which is the sound, if you have ever loved anyone and let yourself keep living, of a promise being kept.